My Best Friends Live in the Woods. The Adventures of Albert by Anne Michelle Mracek.
Happy New Year, dear ones! The ceremony will be our first video in 2025. It holds a blessing for the earth and the spirit of love for family and community, a perfect way to start the new year. It is vitally important that each of us extend love and healing to ourselves. My newly released memoir, Unpacking the Attic, A Path to Healing Your Inner Child, Thoughts and Stories as I Dismantle My Parents' House, guides you through 50 chapters of healing and forgiveness. Take this journey of self-discovery to rewrite the often negative narratives from childhood with an empowered adult perspective. I'm excited to share that Unpacking the Attic has already won 3 awards. Literary Global Book Award for Parenting and Family Self-Help and Best Nonfiction Cover Design, and the American Writing Award for Nonfiction Narrative. The editor of Literary Titan gave a 5-star review. Her 4 paragraphs of praise end with, quote, "Whether you're revisiting childhood memories or simply looking for a heartfelt read, this book, Unpacking the Attic, will wrap you in its warmth and leave you richer for the experience. Highly recommended," unquote. Unpacking the Attic is available on Amazon and my website, annemracek.com, and on the link below. Happy New Year's, everyone. Now let's enjoy the ceremony. Chapter 36, The Ceremony.
Are you sure you'll be all right by yourself while I'm gone? I could send for someone to keep you company.
Mr. Beaver patted his wife's giant belly and smiled at her warmly. If it's not too much out of the way, could you stop by the cave and ask one of the skunk daughters to come over? I would like someone here just in case. I don't think the babies will come today, but you just never know for sure. Mrs. Beaver smiled at her husband.
Of course, good idea.
He smiled.
It shouldn't take too long to build an arbor. It just needs to last one night. Not major construction. I plan on using sapling trees. The thin ones weave together so nicely.
He was imagining his creation, seeing it in his mind's eye. He waddled over to the edge of his cozy stick island home and slid into the pond.
I'll send the skunks,
he called back over his shoulder as he began to slide across the water, leaving a silent V of wake behind him. Mrs. Beaver smiled and waved, then with a sigh rolled over to take a nap. As Mr. Beaver waddled up to the cave, he smiled at the door reef, then knocked loudly. "Come in," he heard. So he pushed open the door and stuck his head in.
"Hello,"
he called out. Molly, Abigail, Melody, and Rosie were all sitting around the kitchen table, weaving flowers into crowns. "What can we do for you this morning?" Abigail asked Mr. Beaver, looking up from her work.
"Good morning,"
he smiled.
"I'm on my way to the Great Glen to build an arbor for the ceremony. I was hoping one of you lovely ladies would go to the pond and keep the missus company while I'm gone. It's getting close to delivery time, and she's a bit nervous to be alone,"
Mr. Beaver explained. "Sure, I'll go," Abigail said as she stood up and brushed the bits of petals from her hands. "I would, but I was leaving to go to Clara's soon," Molly explained. "It's fine. You two go ahead. We were about finished with the flower crowns anyway. Should we just plan on meeting you at the Glen, or will you come home first?" Melody asked Abigail and Molly. "I'll bring Clara here, and we will get ready to go together when Mother gets back," Molly decided. "How long will you be gone?" Abigail asked Mr. Beaver.
"Oh, until after high sun," he said, rubbing his chin.
"Okay then, I'll come home too and get ready here. I really want to go to the Glen with the family," Abigail said as she took off her apron.
"Okay then, I'm off,"
Mr. Beaver said as he stepped out the door. Abigail and Molly were right behind him.
Thanks, Abigail,
he said as he headed toward the glen. Melody and Rosie carefully placed each of the flower crowns into a basket and covered it with a damp towel to keep it cool and moist for the evening ceremony. Oh, I wish I could wear one of these, Melody sighed as she covered the flowers. Oh, not me. I would be so nervous to stand up in front of everyone like that. Rosie shook her head. They are beautiful, she added. Will Albert and Jillian come home before the ceremony starts? Rosie asked Bluebell, who was placing a double batch of gingerbread cookies on the cooling racks. No, they took their purple robes with them to the glen. After the rehearsal this morning, they are invited to stay with Anthina for lunch, Bluebell explained. But Mother will be back, right? Melody asked, a bit worried. Yes, Mother will come home and lead the family to the glen for the ceremony tonight, Bluebell answered her. Charlie wandered in, eyeing the racks of hot cookies. And no, Charlie, you cannot have a cookie. They are the crowning gift for tonight, Bluebell said sternly. They won't miss one, Charlie protested and batted his eyes at Bluebell. This usually worked, since Bluebell had a soft spot for those big blue eyes. Bluebell laughed. You can bat those eyelashes all you want, but the answer is still no. Can I have toast and jelly then? Charlie asked, walking into the kitchen. Yes, dear, of course. Bluebell followed him in and started slicing the loaf of brown bread for him. I would say don't eat too much and spoil your appetite for the feast tonight. But for you, I don't think that's possible. She laughed as she handed Charlie the toast. Thank you, Bluebell. Charlie smiled. Who will take care of me when you get married? Charlie asked, looking up at Bluebell. Jelly on his cheek. You have Mama and 12 other sisters, and I won't be far away, I promise, she said and kissed the top of his head. Now, don't go too far. We will be getting ready after lunch. Molly arrived at Clara's house feeling a bit nervous. It had just occurred to her that they would be singing in front of the whole forest. Singing the sunrise was an intimate gathering, but this was going to be the entire forest. Are you nervous? Molly blurted as she walked up to Clara. How about, good morning, lovely day, Clara laughed. Sorry, but are you nervous? Molly said, wringing her hands. No, not really, Clara said, giving Molly a hug. Just focus on what we are singing. Focus on the love behind the melody, and you'll be fine, Clara said seriously, looking into Molly's eyes. It's not about us. No one will be thinking about us, just our message. Molly sat for a moment reflecting on what Clara had said. You're right, Molly nodded. Thank you. But I still want to practice again, she smiled. Of course, Clara agreed. The glen was buzzing with activity. Tommy Red Fox had teamed up with Jimmy Squirrel to hang the streamers from the tree branches that edged the glen. They made a good team. Tommy would measure and cut the ribbons, and Jimmy would scamper up the tree trunk and run out to the edge of the branch, tie on the ribbon, and scamper back for the next one. As the streamers went up, it encircled the entire glen with flowing color that fluttered with the slightest breeze. This is gonna look great, Tommy said with enthusiasm. Mr. Beaver was hauling sapling trees. The arbor would be erected about a third of the way into the glen. Each creature, great and small, would step through to enter the sacred space. Excuse me, sire, but I need to see if the arbor is big enough for you to pass through, Mr. Beaver said to the great stag, who was in conversation with Owl. Oh, of course, the stag said to Mr. Beaver. Be right back, he said to Owl, and followed Mr. Beaver over to where he had the arbor branches laid out on the grass. Just as I thought,
Need to make it about 2 tail lengths taller,"
Mr. Beaver said, critically eyeing his work.
"Call me again if you need me,"
the stag said back as he walked back to Owl. This was Owl's finest hour. He lived for ceremonies. After all, his official title was Master of Ceremonies, and it fit him perfectly. He had a great talent for arranging every detail.
"So, do you think you could say the invocation?"
Owl was asking Mother Skunk.
"Me?"
She was amazed.
"Of course, who better? You can welcome the helping spirits of the forest and the ancestors to the ceremony."
Owl was quite serious.
"After all, you do spirit walk in dreams."
Owl smiled at Mother Skunk. "Oh, please, Matilda," Clarissa coaxed. "If I was a spirit, I would certainly come if you asked," she smiled.
"Very well, then," Mother Skunk agreed.
"When will we do the actual crowning?" Albert asked the great stag.
"I was thinking after everyone is purified with sage smoke, but before the fire ceremony,"
Matthew answered.
"Yes, good. I'd like the crowning before the prayer sticks are offered. That can take quite a long time."
Owl agreed.
"Let's go over the details,"
Owl said with enthusiasm. He just loved details.
"Oh, good. You're here,"
Owl said as Jillian, Clara, and Molly walked up. "How did your song rehearsal go?" Anthina asked her friends. "Quite well, thank you," Jillian smiled.
"Now that we're all here, let's do a walkthrough,"
Owl said, loving being in charge. In the center of the glen, Ricky and Nicholas were stacking wood to make the bonfire, while George and Timothy and Frank were placing stones to create a prayer circle. They'd been hauling tumbled smooth stones up from the river all week and were now arranging them. Marigold was creating a large fan from feathers. Teresa was her helper and would hand Marigold feathers and hold the twine tight as Marigold attached each feather to a beautiful antler. It was considered a sacred antler from a long distant ancestor of the great stag. New feathers were attached each year for the longest day ceremony. A large bull had been placed in the glen a week ago, and every bird had swooped in to donate one feather. "I wonder if it hurts to pluck a feather," Teresa was musing as they worked. "Probably," Marigold said, eyeing her work and trying to decide on the best placement for each donation as she created the fan. Mrs. Rabbit and Mrs. Badger were seated in the glen next to a rather large pile of twigs and a pile of yarn and ribbon scraps. The piles had grown all week as the offerings were brought by all the forest folk. "I wish Mrs. Beaver could have joined us," Mrs. Badger said as they wrapped a piece of yarn around a twig, tying it in a tight knot. Mrs. Rabbit nodded in agreement. "Well, I know what I'm praying for," Mrs. Rabbit said seriously. A safe delivery and healthy babies for Mrs. Beaver." "Oh, yes, marvelous," Mrs. Badger agreed. The three ladies had become great friends ever since the party to welcome Jillian home and had volunteered to make the prayer sticks offerings for the ceremony. How many do you think we should make?" Mrs. Rabbit asked, eyeing the large pile. "Till the pile is gone, then we are finished," Mrs. Badger said with conviction. Mrs. Rabbit's nose twitched nervously, but she sighed and continued tying ribbon. Gradually, the two piles became one of finished prayer stick offerings, stacked neatly into a large basket. The two ladies stood and attempted to drag the heavy basket into place. "Hold up, I'll get it," Tommy Red Fox called to them. Nicholas noticed Tommy walking over and joined them. He grabbed one side of the basket handle as Tommy got the other. "Thanks," Tommy smiled as the two carried it to the now completed stone circle.
"Well, I think we are done here,"
the stag announced to all assembled.
"Well done. See you all tonight."
Everyone clapped and congratulated each other, then headed in their own directions toward home. "You will stay for lunch, won't you?" Clarissa asked Jillian and Albert. "Yes, thank you." They both smiled and nodded. "I would love for you to stay too, Matilda, but I know you want to get home to the children," Clarissa said to Mother Skunk.
"Yes, thank you. I need to get the group ready, and I think it's important we come together as a family,"
Matilda responded seriously. "Till first peek, then. I need you all here early," Clarissa smiled. Mr. Beaver waddled home as fast as his 4 legs would carry him, pausing only briefly to gather a bunch of dandelion greens for his wife. His worries were relieved as he reached the pond. Abigail and Mrs. Beaver were sitting on the edge of their stick home, feet dangling in the water. He could hear their laughter as he slid into the pond and glided home.
"For you."
He smiled at his wife as he presented his dandelion greens.
"Thank you, dearest."
She smiled and accepted his gift.
"And thank you, Abigail, for a truly lovely afternoon. I do hope you will come back again. Didn't we have a nice visit?"
"Oh, yes, it was fun," Abigail agreed. "Will I see you tonight?" Abigail asked Mrs. Beaver as she stood to leave.
"Wouldn't miss it."
Mrs. Beaver winked. Back at the oak tree, Mrs. Squirrel was anxiously awaiting Jimmy's return. "He's coming," she said to the girls when she spotted him. Just as Jimmy's head peeked over the edge of the nest, they all shouted, "Surprise!" Jimmy's eyes popped wide. "What?" is all he could stammer. Mrs. Squirrel proudly produced a lovely handmade bow tie from behind her back. "For you," she smiled, "to wear for your date tonight," she said lovingly. Jimmy was speechless. It was a splendid bow tie, very elegant indeed. He threw his arms around his mother's neck in a huge hug. "I love it," he said as he kissed her on the cheek. Mother Skunk had arrived home to feed her sizable family lunch, and then insisted they all take a nap.
"We have to be fresh and alert for this evening,"
she had admonished her children as she herded them all onto the great moss bed.
"I'll see you tonight,"
she said to Papa Skunk with a faint smile on her face as she drifted off to sleep in her chair. The whole forest was anticipating the ceremony. Every creature, to the tiniest mouse, was preparing a gift of food for the banquet and washing and brushing head to toe. The girls were tying flowers in their hair, and everyone was dressing in their finest. In the cave, everyone was refreshed from their nap and in a flurry of activity. Bluebell had brought a basket of purple echinacea flowers to tie in their hair. "I thought these matched our new clothes," she announced enthusiastically as she placed the basket on the table. When everyone was dressed in their new purple attire, Mother Skunk clapped for silence.
"A ceremony is a gift, a bridge between us and the world of spirit. A ceremony opens a line of connection between ourselves and the power of the universe to bring healing and blessings. A ceremony directly connects us to the invisible, sacred realms and helps us feel joy and peace. During a ceremony, the veil between worlds dissolves, and our souls are cradled in the hands of our ancestors. Think on these things as we walk together to the great glen."
Then she opened the front door and led them all. Clarissa was waiting for their arrival at the glen. "They're coming," she called back to Owl when she saw the little parade.
"Ooh, very good,"
Owl hooted and flew over. Clarissa lit the sage bundle, and Owl used his own wing to fan the smoke over each of them as they solemnly walked through the arbor.
Oh, live your life to your full creative potential. Welcome to this sacred space,
Owl said with genuine love to each one as they stepped through the arbor. Once they had all been purified with sage smoke and welcomed, the great stag came forward.
Thank you for arriving early. As the rest of the forest arrives, Teresa, will you hold the sage, and Marigold, will you say the greeting for each one as they pass through the arbor?
The two girls nodded and took up their posts by the arbor.
Did you bring the flower crowns?
The stag asked. Yes, sire, Bluebell said as the girls set the 4 baskets in front of the stag.
Excellent. Molly and Clara, please take the flower crowns over to Anthina.
The girls lifted the baskets and scampered across to where Anthina was waiting.
Ricky and Nicholas, thank you for being the firekeepers. I'll let you know when to light the bonfire,
he said, and they took their places as the sun began to set. One by one, the creatures of the forest arrived in solemn procession. Each one was greeted the same way. Marigold repeated Owl's words. Live your life to your full creative potential. Welcome to this sacred space. As she waved the sage smoke over them with the ancestral antler fan, and Teresa held the lit sage bundle. Jimmy arrived, his new bow tie proudly around his neck, and Misty holding onto his arm. She had tied some of the fairy flowers in her hair, and they glowed in the dim light of evening. Albert caught Jimmy's eye and bowed. Who is she? Jimmy just grinned. Mr. and Mrs. Beaver passed through the arbor, and Mrs. Badger rushed over to take her arm, helping Mr. Beaver, who had her arm on the other side. Together, they eased her onto a log chair that had been placed inside the stone circle for her. Chad and Penelope arrived, wearing tiny robes, the other mice following in line behind them. And the dove smiled down and nodded to the two of them. Seems like things have changed, she grinned to herself. By the time every creature had been welcomed and purified with sage, the sun was at the horizon. The great stag nodded to Owl to start. Owl cleared his throat and took a deep breath, spread his wings, and began.
Ooh, the magic of ceremony is being able to leave your ordinary life behind and step into a sacred space. Ooh, we will open our hearts together to create the energy of love, honor, and respect. It is our intention to bless the land and to support each other in light and love. It is our intention to partner with divine forces to provide peace and healing. Everyone is welcome.
Owl bowed and stepped aside for Mother Skunk to step forward. She was wearing her full regalia, a vision of flowing lavender. Her bonnet with its lilies framed her face, and her cape draped around her. She drew a small rattle from her apron pocket and began to shake it softly.
I call in all helping and compassionate spirits and divine forces to join our circle,
she said, and shook her rattle again.
I greet the sacred spirits of the forest,
she said, and shook her rattle.
I call on helping ancestors and the power of the earth, air, water, and fire,
she said, and shook her rattle. Then she bowed and stepped back. Jillian stepped forward, joined by Molly and Clara. They were wearing their flower crowns and looked radiant. At Jillian's nod, they began singing their lovely trio.
Wear a robe of power, may the forest grant you
the great our princess, child of light, heaven's delight, from our hearts manifest, make it so.
Clara had been right. All of Molly's anxiety had dissolved as the blessings of the melody flowed. Al called out, "Presenting the royal Princess Anthina!" Albert stepped forward, holding the flower crown, as Anthina walked across the glen to him. She made a grand entrance as her lavender cape flowed around her. She arrived to kneel in front of Albert as her best friend sang. Albert lifted the crown high for all to see, then turned to face Anthina. "I place this crown on the head of the true princess, daughter to the great stag, heir to the throne," he pronounced in his loudest voice for all to hear. Suddenly, a circle of flashing lights began to sparkle around the crown. As everyone watched in stunned silence, the blossoms transformed into tiny crystal jewels. Anthina gasped with delight. "Like Mama's," she said, eyes twinkling. "Thank you, Fairies," Albert said, then placed the dazzling crown on Anthina's head as everyone cheered. Anthina turned to blow a kiss to the assembled, then stepped over to stand next to her father. The trio continued their lovely melody as Al announced, "Woohoo! Presenting the Royal Queen Clarissa!" Woo-hoo-hoo. Albert lifted the jeweled fairy crown from its basket as Clarissa made a grand entrance across the glen, her lavender robe flowing behind her. She too knelt in front of Albert. "I place this crown on the head of the true queen, wife to the great stag, mother to the heirs of the forest." As he held the crown high, it lifted of its own power and floated over Clarissa's head. The crown began to spin, and sparks of light began to fly off, encircling Clarissa. As the sparks landed, they turned into tiny diamonds that affixed themselves to her robe. Everyone gasped at the wonder of it. Then the crown rested in Albert's hands as he placed it on her head. The trio finished their song as Matthew joined at her side and gave her a kiss. "Clarissa, my true love," he said. "My heart," she replied. Then they turned to face the gathered, and a great cheer rose from every creature. "Will the firekeepers light the bonfire?" Owl said, and Ricky and Nicholas struck their flintstones and sparked the flames. Matthew stepped up to address all gathered. "Will everyone join us as we honor the directions of the earth?" he said as he turned to the east. "Blessed are you, spirits of the east, that bring the energy of the rising sun," he said and bowed his head. Then he turned to the west. "Blessed are you, spirits of the west, that bring the comfort of darkness," he said and bowed his head. Then he turned to the north. "Blessed are you, spirits of the north, that bring the blanket of snow," he said and bowed his head. Then he turned to the south. "Blessed are you, spirits of the south, that bring the warm rains," he said and bowed his head. "We honor and thank the protective ancestors of the land. We honor and thank the creatures of Middle-earth, the fairies, gnomes, and elves with whom we share the forest. May we always live in peace. We acknowledge that we are all part of the interconnected web of life.
We are each a unique being born with a wealth of inner wisdom and talents that each brings to the community. We desire to bond together to receive support and unconditional love as we step forward on our path of life. We call in our spirit helpers to awaken our inner spiritual fire and connect to divine forces.
Then Matthew motioned for Clarissa and Anthina to join him.
Let each family come forward and choose a prayer stick from the basket. Speak your prayers into it with your breath and offer it to the fire. The smoke will rise and carry your prayers to the great Creator.
Then he walked with his family to the basket. They chose a prayer stick and each spoke their prayers. Then Matthew placed the stick into the bonfire and watched as the ribbon began to glow. As they stepped aside, Al came forward.
Will each family come forward?
He hooted. The prayers were lifted toward the stars of the night sky as the smoke curled and the flames grew higher with each prayer stick. Mr. Beaver went up for the two of them, then returned to place his hand on Mrs. Beaver's shoulder. Mr. and Mrs. Badger put their prayer stick in the flames, then joined Mr. Beaver, placing their hands on Mrs. Beaver's shoulder as well. Mrs. Rabbit, Gabby, and George did the same, joining the group behind Mrs. Beaver, each with a hand on her back. As the group grew, others placed their hands on the backs of others till a web of hands flowed behind her, creating a chain of supportive energy. "Oh my!" was all Mrs. Beaver could say as tears of joy flowed down her cheeks. Bluebell and Benjamin came forward together to offer a prayer stick, as did Albert and Clara. Mother Skunk led her children up as they each blew a kiss and a silent prayer into the stick before she added it to the flames. And the dove noticed that the prayer sticks in the basket were too large for Chad and Penelope. She broke off a little sprig of the cedar tree and flew it over to them. "For your prayers," she said as she placed the cedar at their feet. When all the prayer sticks had been offered to the flames, Al once again stepped forward.
We ask the blessings of the fire. Hear our prayers,
he said, and then everyone said aloud together, "Hear our prayers." Al continued.
We ask the blessings of the air. Hear our prayers.
"Hear our prayers," they all repeated. Al continued.
We ask the blessings of the water. Hear our prayers.
"Hear our prayers," they all repeated. Al continued.
We ask the blessing of the earth. Hear our prayers.
"Hear our prayers," the group repeated once more.
Our work here is done,
Al announced.
We thank everyone. We thank and honor the spirits of our ancestors, the forest, and all helping spirits. Now will all place your hands on the ground of this sacred space,
Al instructed. Every creature knelt and placed their hands on the ground.
Let the light-filled spiritual energies flow into the force we love and ground us to her,
Al chanted. Matthew stepped forward.
This concludes our ceremony. Please bring your food offerings forward and let the banquet begin.
Chapter 36. The Ceremony. Discussion and Questions. Participation and Cooperation. The forest community comes together in preparation for the ceremony. We see teamwork and cooperation by everyone to create a sacred space that is truly remarkable. Everyone gives their time and creative energy toward the vision of a perfect evening. Every creature prepares food for all to share. Donations of feathers and ribbons have been gathered for days. Question 1. Is a ceremony more meaningful when everyone in the community participates? Question 2. Can a large group create an incredible event when everyone cooperates?
I am the composer and performer for all the music in this video. Both audio recordings and the printed scores are available on mybestfriendsliveinthe.woods.com. I will provide the link below. The painted illustrations are also my creation. Prints are available on mybestfriendsliveinthe.woods.com. This is a novel. The chapters are meant to be heard in the order in which they were written. And while each chapter can stand alone, they do build as new characters are introduced and past events are referred to. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. The chapters are numbered, so if you're just joining us, be sure to go back and watch from chapter 1.
In a dream, in a trance, my spirit flies to the